Henry wasn't new to chaos. He had worked on everything from derelict mining rigs to luxury orbital stations, and if there was one thing he'd learned, it was that things rarely went as planned. But Zarenth Prime? This was a whole new level of madness. As he stepped off the docking platform, Henry immediately felt out of place. The Calthy station was a swirling mix of alien architecture and bustling activity. The air smelled faintly of ozone, and the constant hum of machinery vibrated beneath his boots. Towering spires of crystalline material shot up into the artificial sky of the station, pulsating with light. Calthy engineers darted around with their 6 arms multitasking at an almost dizzying pace, carrying tools, holographic tablets, and sometimes what looked like snacks. "Welcome, human engineer," boomed a voice from ahead. Henry turned to see Laxi, the station administrator, bounding toward him on long, spindly legs. Laxi was a towering Calthy with vibrant green skin and 2 large glimmering eyes that blinked asynchronously. Despite his imposing appearance, his tone was cheerful, almost too cheerful. "You're smaller than I imagined," Laxi said, all 6 arms spreading wide as if to measure Henry's height. "But I trust your brain is large, yes?" Henry raised an eyebrow. "My brain's big enough to fix whatever mess you've got here." "Excellent. Come. The station is, how do you humans say, ah yes, falling apart." Laxi's enthusiasm was not reassuring. The control center of Zarenth Prime was a sensory overload. The walls were covered in holographic displays showing live feeds of various systems, power levels, atmospheric controls, ship traffic. Dozens of Calthy engineers flitted from one panel to another, their antennae twitching in rhythm with the flashing lights. "Here it is," Laxi announced, gesturing toward a section of the console that had been hastily barricaded with what looked like alien caution tape. "The core problem." Henry knelt down, pushing aside the tape to inspect the exposed control panel. Wires of all colors spilled out like intestines, sparking occasionally. At the heart of it all was a glowing red button, surrounded by a series of warning glyphs in Calthy script. "What's this button for?" Henry asked, pointing at the ominous control. Laxi's antennae twitched nervously. "Ah, that is, a bypass trigger for the power core. A fail-safe, but it does not work as intended." Henry frowned. "What do you mean, not as intended?" "Well," Laxi hesitated, all 6 hands fidgeting. "If pressed, it causes an overload. A very big overload." Henry's jaw tightened. "So this is basically a self-destruct button?" Laxi nodded enthusiastically. "Yes. But very efficient, no?" "No. Absolutely not." Henry snapped. "Why isn't this thing disabled?" Laxi shrugged. "The engineers insisted it might be needed. And it looks important, does it not?" Henry groaned. "All right. First order of business, this button needs to be labeled, in big bold letters, 'Do not press.'" Over the next several hours, Henry worked tirelessly to stabilize the station's failing systems. The power relays were overloaded due to outdated capacitors, and the cooling systems were barely functioning. It was clear the Calthy had a knack for improvisation but lacked any concept of long-term maintenance. As Henry worked, he couldn't help but notice the Calthy engineers watching him intently. Their large eyes followed his every move, and their antennae twitched with curiosity. "What are you staring at?" Henry asked as he soldered a connection. One of the engineers, a young Calthy named Fricks, leaned forward. "Human tools are fascinating. You work with such precision. And your hands. Only 2. How do you manage?" "Years of practice," Henry replied dryly. Another Calthy chimed in. "Why do you mark things, 'Do not press'? Is it a human ritual?" Henry sighed. "No, it's common sense. If something is dangerous, you don't touch it." Fricks tilted his head. "But how do you know it's dangerous if you do not touch it?" Henry paused, looking up from his work to see a dozen Calthy staring at him with genuine confusion. He realized then that this wasn't a joke. This was a fundamental difference in how their minds worked. "Look," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Humans don't need to experience something to understand it's a bad idea. If I tell you not to press that button because it'll blow up the station, you should just trust me." Fricks's antennae drooped slightly. "Trust, yes. But what if we are curious?" Henry groaned. "Then I guess we're all doomed." By the time Henry finished the repairs, the Calthy engineers were buzzing with excitement. They had watched him label the red button in both English and Calthy glyphs, even adding a holographic warning that flashed whenever someone got too close. "This button," Henry said, addressing the gathered Kael'thi, "must never be pressed. Not for any reason. Understand?" The Kael'thi nodded solemnly, but Henry could see the glint of curiosity in their eyes. He knew this wasn't the end of it. As he packed up his tools, Laxi approached, 2 hands extended in what Henry assumed was a gesture of gratitude. "Thank you, Engineer Watts. You have done much for us." Henry shook his head. "Just try not to blow up your own station, okay?" Laxi chuckled. "We will try. But you must understand, Engineer Watts, when something says, 'do not press,' it becomes very enticing." Henry stared at him, dumbfounded. "You're kidding." Laxi grinned, his antennae twitching mischievously. "Welcome to Zarenth Prime, my friend." As Henry walked back to his quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was brewing. He glanced over his shoulder at the control center one last time, muttering to himself, "It's not a matter of if, it's when." The seeds of chaos had been planted, and Henry's instincts told him it wouldn't take long for the Kael'thi's curiosity to sprout into disaster. The day began like any other on Zarenth Prime, an orchestration of controlled chaos. Henry was in one of the lower maintenance bays, repairing a coolant system for the station's agriculture wing, when the station-wide comm system crackled to life. "Attention, attention. There is a minor issue in the main control center. Please do not be alarmed," the voice of Laxi announced, calm but with a slight tremor of panic. Henry's wrench froze mid-turn. Minor issue? In this place, that means something's on fire, or about to explode. His instincts kicked in, and he dropped everything, sprinting toward the control center. The hallways of Zarenth Prime were a blur of Kael'thi engineers rushing in every direction, some holding tools, others just looking panicked. The flashing yellow warning lights lining the corridors didn't help to calm his nerves. As Henry burst into the control center, the scene confirmed his worst fears. The glowing red button, the one he had meticulously labeled "Do Not Press," was flashing furiously. A high-pitched alarm screamed from the console, and the holographic display of the station's reactor showed a dangerously unstable energy reading. The core was pulsing with light, each pulse growing more rapid, signaling an imminent overload. What the hell happened? Henry yelled over the noise. Laxi turned toward him, his usually vibrant green face now a pale shade of chartreuse. "It appears someone pressed the button." Henry's eyes widened in disbelief. "Who pressed it?" The gathered Kael'thi engineers shifted uncomfortably, their antennae twitching as they avoided eye contact. Henry scanned the room until his eyes landed on Fricks, who stood at the edge of the group, looking incredibly guilty. "Fricks!" Henry shouted. "Was it you?" Fricks hesitated, his 6 arms fidgeting. "It wasn't entirely my fault. I was testing something. I didn't mean to press it, my hand slipped." Henry's face turned red with fury. "Your hand slipped? You have 6 of them. How does that even happen?" Before Fricks could respond, the holographic display changed, projecting a timer above the reactor's image. The numbers glowed a menacing red. 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Henry muttered, his heart pounding. What happens in 12 minutes? "The station will, explode," Laxi admitted, wringing his hands. "The overload cannot be reversed." Henry grabbed his toolkit and marched toward the console. "Like hell it can't. Move." Henry dove into the controls, his hands working furiously to access the reactor's systems. The Kael'thi engineers gathered around him, their usual curiosity now replaced with genuine fear. "All right, listen up," Henry barked, not bothering to look up from his work. "I need everyone to shut up and do exactly what I say. Laxi, evacuate the lower levels. Any non-essential personnel need to be off this station now." Laxi hesitated. "But now," Henry snapped. Laxi nodded and hurried out of the room, shouting orders to the other Kael'thi. The control center grew quieter, but the tension was palpable. Henry's fingers flew over the console, rerouting power and disabling auxiliary systems to buy more time. The timer above the reactor read 8:47. "Fricks," Henry said without looking up. "You're going to tell me exactly what you were trying to do." Fricks hesitated. "I was curious. The sign said, 'Do not press,' but it didn't say why. I thought maybe it would unlock a hidden feature or a prize." Henry stopped typing and turned to glare at Fricks. "A prize? You thought the button that could blow up the station might give you a prize. Fricks shrank back, his antennae drooping. It's a Calthy thing. Henry groaned and turned back to the console. Unbelievable. Okay, focus. I can stabilize the reactor, but I need to bypass the overloaded capacitor. Fricks, hand me the flux calibrator from my toolkit. Fricks scrambled to grab the device, nearly dropping it as he handed it over. Henry connected the calibrator to the console and began manually adjusting the reactor's energy output. The timer read 3:12 when Henry hit a roadblock. The overload was still building, and the failsafe systems were locked out. He slammed his fist against the console in frustration. It's not enough, he muttered. The core's too unstable. The Calthy engineers began to panic, their chittering voices rising in volume. Henry spun around, raising his voice to cut through the noise. Hey, focus, he yelled. If we panic, we're dead. I need ideas, anything. One of the engineers, a small Calthy with orange skin, raised a trembling hand. There is an auxiliary venting system, but it hasn't been used in cycles. It might work to release the excess energy. Henry's eyes lit up. Where is it? On the lower deck, near the reactor housing, the engineer replied. But it must be activated manually. Henry checked the timer, 1:45. He grabbed the flux calibrator and turned to Fricks. You're coming with me. Me? Fricks squeaked, his antennae shooting up in alarm. Yes, you. Think of it as your punishment for pressing the damn button, Henry said, already heading for the door. The two of them sprinted through the station, the alarm growing louder as they neared the reactor housing. The air was thick with heat and static electricity, making it harder to breathe. When they reached the venting system, Henry immediately saw why it hadn't been used in cycles. The control panel was corroded, its interface flickering weakly. Of course it's broken, Henry muttered, dropping to his knees to access the panel's internal wiring. Fricks, hold this. Fricks held the flux calibrator as Henry worked, bypassing the damaged circuits and rerouting power to the venting system. The timer in his head ticked down mercilessly. Come on, Henry muttered, sweat dripping down his face. Finally, the venting system roared to life, and a deep rumble shook the station as excess energy was released. The warning lights dimmed, and the alarms fell silent. Henry slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. We did it, he said, looking at Fricks, who was staring at him with wide eyes. We actually did it. Fricks nodded, his antennae twitching nervously. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Henry held up a hand. Save it. Let's just hope everyone else learned their lesson. As they made their way back to the control center, Henry couldn't help but glance over at Fricks. The young Calthy looked genuinely remorseful, but Henry knew better than to trust their impulsive nature. This isn't over, he muttered to himself. Not by a long shot. The control center was eerily quiet as Henry and Fricks returned from the reactor housing. The silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Dozens of Calthy engineers, who had once darted around like hyperactive insects, now stood motionless, their antennae drooping in shame. The glowing red button at the center of the console still pulsed faintly, almost mockingly, as if daring someone to try their luck again. Henry glared at it. That damn button has caused me more stress in one day than my entire career combined. Laxey emerged from the crowd, his normally vibrant demeanor subdued. Engineer Watts, the venting appears to have stabilized the core. You have saved us once again. Henry snorted. Yeah, saved you from yourselves. That button should never have existed in the first place. The room murmured in agreement, but Henry wasn't convinced they fully grasped the gravity of what had just happened. He grabbed a nearby chair, flipped it around, and sat down, staring at the gathered Calthy like a disappointed parent about to deliver a scolding. All right, let's talk about what just happened, he began. Fricks, why don't you explain to everyone why you thought pressing the big, clearly labeled, "Do Not Press" button was a good idea? Fricks hesitated, his 6 hands fidgeting. I was curious. The sign said not to press it, but it didn't say why. I thought maybe it would trigger a test, or something cool. Something cool. Henry repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. You thought the button that could blow up the station might give you a prize? Like a vending machine. Fricks's antennae drooped even lower. It's just, the more we are told not to do something, the more we Calthy feel the need to understand why. Henry leaned forward, rubbing his temples. Let me make this clear. Curiosity is great. It's the reason humanity made it to the stars. But curiosity without caution? That's a recipe for disaster. Laxi stepped forward, clearing his throat. Engineer Watts, I believe this is, how you humans say, a teachable moment. Perhaps you could explain this concept of caution further. Henry stood, pacing in front of the console. Caution means thinking about the consequences of your actions before you take them. It means understanding that some things, like that button, are dangerous because they're designed to be. When someone tells you not to touch something, it's not a challenge. It's a warning. The Kael'thi exchanged uncertain glances. One of the younger engineers raised a hand. But how do we know what will happen if we do not test it? Henry sighed. You don't always need to know. Sometimes, you just have to trust that the warning is there for a reason. Would you stick your hand into an open fire just to see what happens? The engineer hesitated. No. But only because we know fire burns. Henry nodded. Exactly. And now you know what that button does. It almost killed all of us. Lesson learned, right? The Kael'thi murmured in agreement, their antennae twitching with what Henry hoped was understanding. Despite his frustration, Henry couldn't ignore the fact that Kael'thi curiosity was deeply ingrained in their culture. He had seen it in their workstations, where experimental designs were piled on top of each other with little regard for practicality. He had heard it in their endless questions about human tools and practices. It was who they were. As the engineers dispersed to their stations, Henry turned to Laxi. We need to do more than just talk. That button has to go. Laxi's antennae shot up in alarm. Remove it? But it is part of the original design. Exactly, Henry said, pulling a multi-tool from his belt. And the original design is flawed. If you really need a bypass system, I'll install one that's safer, something hidden, with multiple fail-safes. Laxi hesitated, but eventually nodded. Very well, Engineer Watts. If you believe it is necessary. Oh, it's necessary, Henry muttered as he approached the console. With a few quick adjustments, he disabled the red button, sealing it behind a protective cover that required multiple biometric verifications to access. The glowing light finally dimmed, and Henry felt a small wave of relief. As he worked, Henry noticed Fricks lingering nearby, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. What do you want, Fricks? Henry asked without looking up. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, Fricks said quietly. I didn't mean to cause so much trouble. Henry paused, turning to face the young Kael'thi. Look, I get it. Curiosity is part of who you are, and that's not a bad thing. But you've got to learn when to stop and think. One mistake could have killed everyone on this station, including you. Fricks nodded solemnly. I understand. I will do better. Good, Henry said, turning back to his work. Because if you pull another stunt like that, I'm putting you on reactor cleaning duty for a year. Fricks's antennae twitched in alarm. Understood. By the end of the day, the red button was nothing more than a memory, replaced by a secure panel that only Henry and Laxi could access. The reactor was stable, the alarms were silent, and for the first time in weeks, Henry felt like he could breathe. As he returned to his quarters, exhausted but satisfied, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. Curiosity might not kill the cat, he muttered, but it sure as hell puts everyone else at risk. Still, a part of him admired the Kael'thi's relentless desire to understand. If they could learn to temper that curiosity with caution, there was no telling what they might achieve. For now, though, Henry was content with having survived another day on Zarenth Prime. Henry woke to the rare sound of silence. No alarms, no frantic Kael'thi scurrying through the halls, and no explosions. It was almost unsettling. For the first time since he'd arrived on Zarenth Prime, everything seemed calm. He made his way to the control center, half expecting to find something on fire. Instead, he found Laxi standing near the now-sealed panel that had once housed the infamous red button. A group of Kael'thi engineers, including Fricks, stood at attention, their antennae straightened in a posture Henry had come to recognize as serious concentration. Good morning, Engineer Watts, Laxi greeted, his tone unusually formal. We have gathered to discuss what you humans call protocols. Henry raised an eyebrow. Protocols. Yes, Laxi continued, gesturing to a holographic display. After much reflection on recent events, we have concluded that our curiosity, while a strength, can also be a danger. We wish to learn how to balance it with caution. Henry leaned against a console, crossing his arms. I didn't think you'd take this so seriously. Laxey's antennae twitched in embarrassment. Your actions saved our station and likely our lives. We owe it to you, and to ourselves, to change. Henry glanced at the gathered Kael'thi engineers. They looked genuinely eager to learn, their wide eyes fixed on him. He sighed. All right. Let's start with the basics. For the next few hours, Henry walked them through fundamental safety practices. He explained the importance of warning signs, risk assessment, and the need for strict protocols in high-risk environments. The Kael'thi took notes on their holographic tablets, occasionally asking questions. What if a sign says, "Do not press," but we suspect it might be necessary in an emergency? One engineer asked. Good question, Henry said. In that case, you consult the protocols first. If there's any doubt, you get clearance from someone who knows what they're doing. Never assume. Another Kael'thi raised a hand. And what if there is no time to ask? Henry paused, considering the question. Then you weigh the risk. If pressing the button is the only way to save lives, you make that call, but only if you're absolutely sure. And even then, you document everything afterwards so others can learn from it. The Kael'thi murmured among themselves, nodding in agreement. It was clear that this kind of structured thinking was new to them, but they embraced it with the same enthusiasm they applied to their experiments. By the end of the session, Henry was exhausted but impressed. The Kael'thi might have been reckless, but they weren't incapable of change. He could see the wheels turning in their minds, their curiosity now tempered with a sense of responsibility. Laxey approached him, holding out a small glowing crystal. Engineer Watts, this is a token of our gratitude. It is a rare mineral from our homeworld, known as Zerithium. It symbolizes balance, between knowledge and wisdom, curiosity and caution. Henry took the crystal, its surface warm to the touch. Thanks, Laxey. I'll keep it as a reminder that even the most curious minds can learn restraint. Laxey bowed slightly. And we will keep your lessons as a reminder that caution can lead to even greater discoveries. As Henry prepared to leave Zarenth Prime, he couldn't help but feel a pang of reluctance. The Kael'thi had grown on him, their boundless enthusiasm reminding him of why he had become an engineer in the first place. Their journey toward balancing curiosity and caution was just beginning, but Henry was confident they'd succeed. Before boarding the SS Pioneer, he turned to Fricks, who had come to see him off. Fricks, I've got one last piece of advice for you. Fricks's antennae perked up. Yes, Engineer Watts. Next time you see a button that says, "Do not press," don't just think about what it might do. Think about who might get hurt if you're wrong. Fricks nodded solemnly. I will remember. As the airlock closed behind him, Henry smiled. He might have saved Zarenth Prime from destruction, but more importantly, he had left behind a lesson that could save them from themselves. The SS Pioneer drifted away from the station, and Henry leaned back in his seat, watching Zarenth Prime shrink into the distance. He held the Zerithium crystal in his hand, its glow a quiet reminder of the delicate balance between curiosity and caution. And somewhere deep inside the station, behind a reinforced panel and multiple layers of security, the red button remained untouched, a relic of a lesson learned.